This is Duke University.
Global trade and environmental justice.
Human rights issues are still.
The term Ubuntu.
The Alien and Sedition Acts.
Is making inferential discovery.
The importance of an archive.
The John Hope Franklin Center.
No, I am really pleased that the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, its Canada Institute, could be a co-partner on this. I've personally worked with the program here at Duke for years, and it's a real pleasure to finally get here. And I also hope to be able to take the tour of the campus, as the Provost said earlier. The Wilson Center's Canada Institute exists to increase knowledge and awareness of Canada and Canada-U.S. relations among U.S. policymakers and opinion leaders. That's a tough sell in Washington. Canada's not usually a problem. One of the issues we work on is energy, which is, if you look at it, a problem. It's something we all need to deal with. We also look at trade issues and border issues, things that are important in the Canada-U.S. relationship. I'd also like to say I'm very pleased this morning that two members of my advisory board could be with us, Ambassador Jacobson and Ambassador David Wilkins, Ambassador Jacobs' predecessor. Just a little bit of housekeeping. Bios are in the program you have. And for those of you who are watching this on the webcast or are watching it later, the bios are listed on the website at dukeenergyconference.org. Each panelist this morning will have up to about 12 minutes to make their presentation. We will go in the order in the program. And so at this point, I would like to turn it over to Thierry Vandal.
Morning all. It's great to be here, ambassadors. I'm a little worried this morning, I have to tell you. I know you guys have something called March Madness. We have something that's very similar that's going to start tomorrow night. It's hockey. I mean, if you know anything about Quebec, about Montreal, you know it's a hockey town. And I'm a little worried right now. Hockey is very important in Montreal and Quebec. There's an election going on right now in Canada. And there's a scheduling conflict between what the equivalent of a presidential debate and the candidates debate and the hockey game in Quebec. And obviously hockey prevailed, so the candidates were shunted to tonight, and the hockey game's going to be tomorrow night. Why I'm worried is that there are a few things in life that we can take, a number of things actually we can take in Quebec, and there's one thing that we can't take, it's losing to Boston. And Boston, we're facing Boston this year. Boston's pretty strong, if you guys know anything about hockey. Boston's pretty strong, so I'm a little worried, but there will be another miracle in Montreal, and we will prevail, I'm sure. Having said that, I'm here to talk about energy with very distinguished panels, colleagues of mine from the great industry in Canada. There is a history between Duke and Quebec, as was mentioned. It goes, and it's really across Hydro-Quebec and hydroelectricity. This generation, leading back to Ambassador Jacobson's points, this generation is called upon to meet some very great challenges, one of which is going to be to provide the growing needs of our economies in the coming decades, while at the same time, because people expect this, while at the same time reducing the environmental footprint of our energy mix, certainly in North America. Now, this is admittedly quite a challenge. To put things in perspective, today in North America, 1 out of every 2 kilowatt hours of electricity is produced from coal. Coal is quite abundant in North America, but the environmental footprint associated with coal is today quite significant. From the coal mine to the plant emissions, to the coal ash, to the cooling water needs, coal has quite an environmental footprint. At the same time, we run our transportation sector, the cars, trucks, trains, and planes that move our people and our goods almost exclusively with oil. President Obama's talked about this dependence on oil, which is very much prevalent in the U.S. and North America. And that carries today some very significant geopolitical risks for our economies. Last time I was down here in North Carolina was back in July 2008, right at the peak of the pre-recession peak for oil at $146. I remember because I drove down from Montreal to the Outer Banks And I can tell you, fueling up on the way down, I knew it was long, but I didn't know it was going to be that expensive. Now we're back to a little over $100, $106, I think, last close, and that's just coming out of a recession. So you can imagine what could be ahead. Who would have predicted the events in the Middle East 6 months ago? And who can be sure what's in store in the coming decade? That's why growing our North American resources is so important, especially from my perspective, obviously, those renewable resources that are the most cost competitive. But also other important North American resources like shale gas that, while they're not renewable, can help improve the environmental footprint of the power sector in North America in terms of air emissions, for sure, and probably also greenhouse gas emissions. Although I note that there's a Cornell study that's just come out yesterday on the question of shale-related greenhouse gas emissions that has stirred some debate. I haven't seen the study, so I can't comment, but I know that there's a bit of a debate around greenhouse gas emissions associated to shale production. So how do we put all these pieces together to get to the energy supply that we need in North America, but at the same time reduce the environmental footprint? I think this generation, certainly my generation, is fully committed to this idea of reducing the environmental footprint for the energy supply that we're going to put forward. If you put all the pieces together, well, you start with more energy efficiency. And there's a lot that can be done in this area. I think North America in general is a fairly latecomer to this if you compare it to other regions in the world. But there's a lot that can be done in our homes, our plants, our cars, our trucks, everywhere. Energy efficiency is something where we can do better than what we're doing today. Hydro-Quebec is very active in that area. Then for the power we'll need once we've done full effort, full court press, as you'd say, on energy efficiency, for the power we'll need, we see more renewable power, including hydropower, and I'll get into that in a minute, and also more gas-powered generation, because it is quite an improvement in terms of the overall environmental footprint. This will lead to a cleaner supply mix, power supply mix in North America, and with that cleaner power supply mix will serve the growing needs of our economies for power, including new applications, new very exciting applications like electric mobility, electric cars, electric mass transit, leveraging off the exciting technologies that have emerged in the field. Again, Hydro-Quebec is very involved in this area, and I'll tell you more in a minute. So here's what we're doing at the present time to grow the supply of clean, renewable power to the U.S. markets we reach. First, let me introduce Hydro-Quebec. Is someone... okay. Thank you. Hydro-Quebec is the largest power producer in North America today, with an installed capacity of a little over 40,000 megawatts. My friend Jim Rogers out of Duke Energy here, Charlotte, is going to beat us at this in the coming months with a merger that's taking place between Duke and Progress Energy. I'm quite confident that they'll get that done, and when that happens, the bragging rights for being the largest power producer in North America will go to my friend Jim, and it'll be well-deserved. We've been blessed with a geography and a geology that's great for large hydropower facilities with a very limited environmental footprint. We're today a $66 billion company in terms of assets. Our net income last year was a little over $2.5 billion. We're the local distribution company across most of Quebec, but we also sell a lot of power at the wholesale level in the U.S. We sold about $1 billion worth of power last year to the U.S. Northeast. We would have done a lot more, but it was a dry year in northern Quebec, so we had to hold up in terms of the volumes we were moving to the U.S. Hydro-Quebec also ranks as among the largest power transmission companies in North America. The large hydro facilities, which are the core of our supply, are about 1,000 kilometers north of Montreal. That's quite a distance. So you need a very large, a very sophisticated transmission system to move this power south to the consumption areas. Finally, Hydro-Quebec is the largest project management firm in Canada. We do our own project management, procurement, engineering, and on-site project management. We have a little over $20 billion worth of projects underway as we speak. We're currently in a very active phase of hydropower development in Quebec. We have two major projects under construction right now. The East Main Rupert project in the James Bay area of Quebec. Those not too familiar with Quebec, James Bay is it's the bay right at the mouth, at the foot of Hudson Bay. It's an area very, very rich in rivers, large rivers, and it's an area where we've done quite a bit of development in the past, and we're continuing. Then we're also building the Romaine River project, which is in the far east end of Quebec. That's a 3-hour flight from Montreal. Quebec is 3 times the size of France. Our large reservoir areas cover the size of some states in the U.S., to put things in perspective. It's a large area, land area. East Main Rupert is a $7 billion project. We'll be completing that project a little ahead of schedule and under budget as things are going now sometime next year. The Romaine project is a $6.5 billion project for the generation itself. We started the construction a couple of years ago, and we first had to build 200 kilometers of roads, camps to lodge 2,500 workers. So these are quite a challenging project. Together, these two projects are going to produce 20 billion kilowatt hours of energy each year. A state like California, that's about 10% of what a state like California would consume in a year. So these are large projects. California is a large state, consumes a lot of power, so these are large projects. We have 3 conditions we look to before we commit to any large hydro project. We're committed. Hydropower is renewable, but it's also fundamental for us to make sure it's done in an environmentally sensitive way. So the 3 conditions we look to before we commit to a project. First, obviously, it's got to make economic sense. We look at long-term power prices. We're in the business of producing on a renewable basis for very extended periods of time, so we look at power prices over the very, very long term. And so far, if past experience is right, it proves us right, we've been okay with that. Second, our projects have to make environmental sense. The people at Hydro-Quebec have a very, very strong relation to the land and its resources. No one wants to be associated to a project that would be harmful to the north. Quebec is our home. That's where our ancestors came, and we have a very, very strong bond to that land, so we're not going to do anything that's going to harm the land in the south or the north. So what we've done over the past 20, 30 years is really combine the best of environmental science in terms of the understanding of northern habitat protection, but also merge that with very, very important traditional knowledge that can be provided by the local Aboriginal communities in the north, predominantly the Cree, the Inuit, but the Cree in a number of areas where we're present. And that brings me to the third condition. For us to start a project, we'll only start if we have full support of the local Aboriginal communities. We'll spend years working on this, listening to the elders of these Aboriginal communities, for example, exchanging information so that the traditional knowledge that they've developed over thousands of years can be built in to the project planning cycle, taking into account the real concerns and expectations that these people have, taking the time to listen, which is so important. And finally, once we think we've got a project, negotiating the agreements that are going to be voted upon by the people. Let me give you an example of what this means. The Rupert project, the Rupert East Main project, $7 billion project, I was, before I became CEO, I was responsible for our generation activities. I was spending a lot of time traveling up to the north, meeting in the communities. You go to one of these communities, the Waskaganish community, for example, and these are relatively small communities, 1,000 people, and you sit down, and you'll be sitting down for about 8 hours. You get there in the morning, you'll be sitting straight through 8 hours, and you're going to do a lot of listening. The elders will come up to a microphone, and they'll basically tell you a story. There's no debate. They're just going to tell you a story of the land, their relationship to it, and what's important for them in the land. You're not expected to answer. You're expected to listen. They talk in Cree, so it'd be, I get translation. Cree is sounds like a fairly aggressive language. It's not. These are very, very friendly people. But you're expected to listen. So after one of these days of listening for 8 hours, the chief thought that I needed a little more. And this was a chief who's passed away now, one of the great Aboriginal leaders in Canada, Billy Diamond. And he said, Terry, come on over. I'm going to take you to a place very, very important for us. So we went to the river, the Waskaganish River, and he took me on a canoe with a motor. We went upriver for about half an hour to a place at the foot of a rapid, a huge rapid, place you fall in the water, you're going to be dead. And this was a spawning area for cisco, whitefish, they say in the Cree word. And it's a spawning area where traditionally they've gone to fish every fall during the spawning season. And so he says, Terry, you're going to go out in these rocks. You're going to skip rocks. I'm wearing these leather shoes, not dressed for the occasions. You're going to skip rocks, and you're going to get to the middle of the river, this very, very long pole. And at the end of the pole, there's a net, a catchment net, and you're going to stick that net into between two rocks in the river. So I get to the middle of the river, and looking around, wondering, hoping I'm not going to fall over. And so I get to the middle, and all of a sudden, a number of people from the community get out as I'm sitting there, and they have long poles, and they start to bang on the water. And they're banging away, and I'm sitting there, standing there in the middle of the river with a long pole and net. And after 30 minutes, I kind of feel that there's a lot of weight building up in that net. He says, okay. And so I pull the pole, and I had to tell you, this is like Jesus Christ pulling, there's 500 fish in that net. I put it on my back, and I bring it over, and he says, Terry, this is important to us. You better goddamn make sure that when you do your project, you're going to preserve the site. So I went back to our engineers. I said, the guys, I don't know what you're going to do, but you're going to preserve that site. And Chief Diamond passed away last year. We inaugurated that part of the project last year. I had the chance to fly over and to stop there, and it's still a great site, so we're very proud of what we did there. But it's really fundamentally about listening and taking the time to go out on the land. Now, we're also integrating wind power on the grid in Quebec. We'll have about 4,000 megawatts integrated by 2015. Hydropower and wind power are a great fit. Wind is renewable, but variable. Hydro is renewable, but reliable. So, it's a great fit when you put the two together. Now, we've been selling, as was mentioned, we've been selling clean renewable power to the U.S. Northeast since the 80s. About 30% of Vermont's electricity is currently supplied by Hydro-Quebec. We signed a new contract last August to continue this out to 2038. And if Vermont decides to shut, if it were to decide to shut its only nuke plant in the coming years, we'll be there to provide replacement power. Over the last 10 years, Hydro-Quebec's exports, to put this in the context of the environmental footprint, Hydro-Quebec's exports to the U.S. have resulted in about 40 million metric tons of avoided greenhouse gases in the U.S. Northeast. That's the equivalent of taking 1 million cars off the roads over that full period. One of the keys to increasing renewable energy supply is the transmission grid. Ambassador Jacobson referred to that. You need the grid capacity if you're going to move the energy. Renewables sometimes are where, sometimes, renewables is always where the resource is, not necessarily where the consumption is. So you need that transmission grid to link the two. Limited transmission capacity and bottlenecks are major obstacles to the flow of renewable power in the U.S. And that's why we're involved right now in a number of transmission initiatives in the Northeast, in New England, across New Hampshire, to bring additional power to that very important market area for us, but also working with the folks in New York who are dealing with some issues around consumption and supply down south, downstate New York, where we're also involved with the project. North-south transmission projects, multi-billion-dollar projects, very, very challenging projects, but you're projects that have to get done. You can't have a cleaner energy supply mix if you don't build up the transmission to move renewable power to markets. We're also active in this area with U.S. partners. Let me close by saying a few words on a very exciting development in our industry, the electric car. Electric cars are hitting the market this year, as you know, the Nissan Leaf. I thought, by the way, they had one of the best Super Bowl ads with a polar bag hug at the end, but also the Volt from GM, the iMEV from Mitsubishi, the Focus from Ford, etc. Every car manufacturer that we know of is involved in this and is going to have some products in the showrooms pretty soon. And you know the technology is going to continue to advance very fast. Don't let the naysayers, tell you that the technology isn't there and it's dead on arrival. This is a technology that is good as it is today, but is going to improve, going to continue to improve. Electric cars are a major paradigm shift. Your fuel is at home. It's where you park your car. At home, at work, at the restaurant. Hydro-Quebec is going to be involved in deploying that recharge infrastructure, most of which is going to be just connecting in at your home. In Quebec, to put things in perspective, on average it costs you $2,000 a year to fuel your car. With electricity, it'll cost you $200 to do the same mileage. So, I mean, there are strong economic factors involved. We're involved with some of the technology, battery materials, for example, which is the key to range autonomy for electric cars and buses. We've got a great material, you may have heard of it, it's called lithium iron phosphate. It's a very stable version of lithium-ion technology. It's the next standard. We developed this with the University of Texas over the last 10 years. You'll see it soon in power tools, cells, laptops, and I'm sure in future generations of electric cars also. There's also a battery. I didn't bring it. I was afraid they'd grab it at the customs on the flight down, but it's a battery that was developed also by Hydro-Quebec and partners. It has, if you know things about a battery, a cathode, anode, and electrolyte in the middle. This one uses lithium iron phosphate at the cathode side and a titanium blend at the cathode, at the anode side. And it allows very, very fast recharge. It's the size of about a AA battery, and it carries about 3 times the energy content. And you can recharge this fully from 0 to 100% in 3 minutes. It'll cost you $350 to be produced. We produce these things right now in Taiwan, and the city of Shanghai has ordered a number of buses, public buses, equipped with battery packs that are going to be using this material from our Taiwanese partner. So the materials are developing, and I'm convinced that new generations of material are going to just broaden the autonomy of these cars, and that the paradigm shift of fueling at home instead of at the gas station is very much on. These exciting developments around renewable energy and applications like electric cars in the coming years are exciting to our industry. It's a great time to be in the business, and I hope that as you graduate from here, you'll be looking at joining this very, very exciting industry. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, David, and good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and thank you very much for the invitation to come to this beautiful campus and to have a chance to chat with you about Canada-U.S. energy relationships. I think this conference is a great idea, and I think the ambassador put it very well in his remarks earlier. We need to better understand the energy relationship between Canada and the U.S. on both sides of the border. I think we probably have a little more appreciation on the Canadian side of the border for it than is the case in the U.S., and that's one of the reasons why we're here today, is to try to help with that understanding. I've got a few minutes to provide a little bit of context about Enbridge, my company, what we do, and the very important role that we play in terms of Canada-U.S. energy relationship. I'd like to spend a few minutes doing that, and then I would like to take a few minutes to talk about some of the huge challenges that we face in our industry right now, and really as a society in general with regard to energy development, because it's not always as easy for the rest of us as it is for Terry right now in developing hydro. So let me give you kind of the brief Enbridge context, or commercial, you might say, to help provide some background. We're an energy transportation company. We move oil, we move natural gas, and we're also in the business of green energy development. Parts of the company extend back over 160 years in the natural gas business and well over 60 years in the crude oil business. We've got about 6,400 employees, about 2,200 of whom are in the U.S. If I could just key up that first slide, please. This map illustrates the extent of our systems right across North America. And I'm going to do a little bit of a build on this map for reasons that I'll explain later on as we go. So oil and gas pipelines, the oil pipelines shown in yellow on the map, the blue are the gas pipelines, and of course green energy generation as shown. I'd like to start out now and highlight, first of all, the gas systems and talk about the scope of those natural gas systems. So if we could have the next slide. We transport natural gas from Western Canada, primarily, also, though, from the southern U.S. and from the Gulf of Mexico. We move about 7 billion cubic feet per day of natural gas. The systems transport at least a portion of the natural gas that's used for heat, transportation, electricity generation, and industry in Ontario, in Quebec, in New Brunswick, and in 39 different states in the United States. In fact, I understand that Duke University is a natural gas user. That's not too surprising. And there's a pretty good chance that the natural gas that's used here has been through an Enbridge pipeline system somewhere along the way. Moving on to the green energy map of the company, we now have 7 operating wind farms. We have the world's largest photovoltaic solar facility in Sarnia, Ontario. We're involved in waste heat recovery and fuel cell technology. And we're connected, of course, to the North American electrical grid, and the collected output from all of these green energy sources could power a city the size of Charlotte. And by the way, I checked with the driver last night because I knew I had that reference in here to find out whether there was a lot of rivalry back and forth between Raleigh and Durham, and Charlie said, no, don't worry about it. I could use the Charlotte reference. So this map shows the facilities that we've got in operation, but we've got many others under construction as well, including a 250 megawatt wind farm near Denver and a geothermal facility in Oregon. So our green energy business right now is the fastest growing part of the business at Enbridge. It represents only 1% of the net earnings of the company at this point in time, but at the rate at which it's growing, it'll be 3 to 4 times that over the next 4 to 5 years. Moving on to the part of the business that we're most well known for, and that is our crude oil pipeline system. We operate what is the world's longest, largest, and most complex crude oil pipeline system. And if you check the Guinness Book of Records, it will confirm that. We are in the Guinness Book of Records. We move about 2 million barrels a day of crude oil. The pipelines have a tremendous and a largely unrecognized positive impact on a vast number of people in North America. Enbridge alone delivers 13% of all the crude oil the U.S. imports to meet its daily demands, and we're the single biggest conduit of crude oil into the U.S. on any day. So if you fill up your car anywhere, first of all in Canada, from Alberta to Ontario, there is a 99% chance that the crude oil or the refined product came through the Enbridge system. Or if you fill up in any of the states shown on this map, almost for sure that crude oil or refined product came through our system. And a point that I'd like to make, and I'm going to get into this when I comment a little bit about some of the challenges that we face, is that it's not just filling up your car that we're talking about. It's filling up school buses, it's filling up ambulances, it's filling up fire trucks, police vehicles, and very essential services. It often, the crude oil and refined product that we move is used as emergency backup for power generation at hospitals and for critical infrastructure. It's used to fill up transportation trucks that move food and vegetables across the continent. So that's the impact on the ground, and I'm going to come back in a minute, but let's also move to the next slide and look at the impact in the air. If you board a plane in almost any of the areas shown on the map, you're most likely going to be using fuel refined and crude oil moved through the Enbridge system. So that's kind of to give you a little bit of an idea of the impact of the business and the fact that we've been very safely and efficiently delivering energy to markets in Canada and the US for decades. And I like to refer to this, to some of our younger employees, as our 4G network. And I put it in those terms because I think probably this audience can identify it a little more. To catch more attention with the young audience, if I refer to this as my coverage area, my 4G network. We don't have any lost calls. We don't have any roaming charges. We just simply deliver. And there was a time, and this is the point that I would like to make, when people were as thrilled to have this kind of coverage come to their neighborhood as they are now to have 4G coverage come to their neighborhood. It's long forgotten, but there was a day when this was viewed as critically as important. Now we all take it for granted that it's going to be there. I think these maps really underscore the importance of energy to society, and one company alone having the breadth of impact as our company does, and there are many others in very similar business and with similar impacts. So just let me explore a little bit that importance. Energy, in my mind, is a great enabler, and I think we all would admit that if we think back. It really defines the difference between a developing country and a developed country. That's so obvious right now in some of the developing countries around the world. One of the prime objectives is access to easy, affordable energy. We've certainly got it big time in North America in terms of energy. We might occasionally grumble about the price of electricity, not in Quebec, but in many parts of North America, or about the price of a gallon of gasoline, as we've seen over the last little while. But we can't forget the huge and vast energy infrastructure that brings that resource safely and reliably to our doors and provides that coverage I was referring to uninterrupted almost every day of the year. It really enables the society in which we operate. But many people have forgotten that along the way. So we see a rising tide of activism in our industry. And by the way, it's not a lot of fun to work some days in an industry that doesn't get an awful lot of support, largely because those benefits have been forgotten. The activism seems to be oriented towards saying no to energy development projects and to initiatives that we think are critically important. I think it's one of the greatest challenges that we face in our society today is the fact that we all seem to want to say no to new development. We've obviously got a lot of activists that say no to nuclear, and recent incidents have caused those voices to get even louder. They say no to coal for a lot of the reasons that Thierry indicated earlier, and there's some good reasons, but they say no to that. They say no to oil. You know, there's a huge off-oil movement, as I'm sure you're all aware. They say no to fracturing wells for natural gas, which I think is one of the potential big solutions we've got in North America. They used to say no an awful lot to hydro. I mentioned to Thierry at a meeting we were at a few weeks ago in Montreal that he's the golden boy today, but I remember days when building a hydro dam and the mess associated with the hydro dam was not all that popular. Today, hydro relatively is viewed as, but you'll have your day, Terry. But the same people that say no to all of that development say yes to light switches, they say yes to gas pedals, and to use of energy. And I find those things just very, very inconsistent. They say yes to school buses, to ambulances, to hospital energy supply. So I think the question that I really have and would like to pose to an audience like this is, can we have abundant, reliable, and inexpensive energy without energy development? And I think you'll all say no, that we have to have energy development. We also have to move towards a more renewable slate. We all know that. But as indicated earlier, that's going to take a long time. And we can't even do that without large-scale development. If you took the footprint of the oil sands, which Rick George is going to speak to in a few moments, and then you took the footprint to generate the same amount of energy from something as innocuous as run-of-the-river, the footprint of run-of-the-river is far greater than the footprint of the oil sands. So once again, it's that environment of saying no to all development that's a real challenge. We recognize the responsibility to reduce our impact as a company, and one of the challenges that we've taken on at Enbridge is to adopt a neutral footprint to our development going forward. And what we mean by that is that for every acre that we use in creating right-of-way, we will dedicate an acre through a nature conservancy. For every tree that we have to remove to create safe right-of-way, we're going to plant a tree. We've got a huge tree planting program underway now in North America. And for every kilowatt of energy that we use to move oil or natural gas through our system, we'll generate a kilowatt of renewable. And that's our commitment to adopting a neutral footprint. We're on target to be there by 2015 with regard to our new projects. So we consider ourselves to have effectively and safely hardwired the second biggest crude oil reserve in the world in the oil sands in Western Canada with the best market in the world in the U.S. Midwest. And I know the ambassador made reference to a new pipeline project that's being planned to take crude oil to the U.S. Gulf Coast, and there's a lot of controversy because it does involve oil sands crude. But I'm sure that the people opposed to that realize that we're already moving 2 million barrels a day of Canadian crude oil, and much of that goes into the U.S. market. This is just a further addition to it. Our system is very extensive, but we continue to work and expand the capacity. And we're currently in the process of significantly increasing our capacity out of the Bakken to move more light oil down into the U.S. Midwest. Our regional infrastructure in the oil sands is expanding daily. We proposed a Monarch pipeline from Cushing south to debottleneck the Cushing market. And we're proposing also a pipeline off the west coast of Canada to broaden out Canada's markets to become more of an international player in the oil business. And this is a project that has received a fair bit of opposition from First Nations. When I was in Montreal with Thierry a few weeks ago, he suggested that I needed to spend more time, and he has repeated that today. He used a rabbit trapping analogy in Montreal today. It was fishing. So I do need to be spending more time with First Nations in order to ensure that the full benefits of this Gateway project come to them, and that's Enbridge's intent, is to do that. But we all know that carbon-based energy, of course, is going to be used for a long time in North America. And we have to ensure that although we're in the middle of a transition, that we very responsibly develop what we have. And that's one of the reasons for this neutral footprint approach at Enbridge. I think recent developments, as referenced in the Middle East, have shown how volatile the world energy supply situation can be, and why the interconnectedness of this Canada-US energy supply and demand is so critically important to both nations. And this has really only helped to emphasize it. North American supply is substantial, and it is generally free-flowing back and forth between the two countries. So with that very brief overview, and to put Enbridge in context, I will look forward to the questions and comments later on in the panel. Thank you.
That's the only slide you're going to see from me. I guess I'm up here a little more naked than my prior speakers were. But listen, I'm delighted to be here. I am the oil sands guy here today and the oil industry guy. And I realize if any of you filled your cars up this morning, I'm probably not your favorite person. I would just say, don't blame me entirely. We're actually trying to expand production to cheapen oil. It's just that worldwide oil demand is not totally in our control. I can promise you that. And I thought the ambassador did a terrific job of setting the stage for this discussion, and I'm going to focus my remarks mostly around Suncor and oil sands, and mostly around the industry in general, not as much around Suncor specific. And what I'd really like to do here is talk frankly about future growth plans, the opportunities, and probably the thing you're most interested in is our key challenges for the future, including the critical issue of how we grow this industry in a socially and environmentally responsible manner. Just two notes on Suncor. We are the largest oil and gas company in Canada. We are the fifth largest in North America. The only ones that are larger than we are is Exxon, Conoco, Chevron, and Occidental. Although, listen, one of my goals here is to take Occidental on to become the fourth. So, you always have goals in life. We also are the largest player in the oil sands. We were the pioneering company. We're also the largest refiner, the largest retailer in Canada. We also have about 30% of the market share of gasoline, jet, and diesel in the Colorado region. We are also the largest biofuel producer in Canada, and like my two colleagues on the panel here, although we're smaller certainly than Terry is, we're a wind power producer from 3 or 4 different provinces in Canada as well. So we all are very similar in that regard of all having renewable energy programs as well. At the end of this remarks, though, my goal is to really convey a sense of how I think Americans should view oil sands development as an integral and a key part, and something you can be proud of in terms of the economic future and the real desire around a North American energy strategy and energy security. I do have a pretty unique perspective on this subject. In addition to the fact that, and I know the average life cycle of CEOs is about 5 years, but this year I actually celebrate my 20th year as the CEO of Suncor. Not many CEOs get a chance to say that. I'm also very proud of the fact that when we took Suncor public in 1992, We had a market cap of $1 billion. Last week we were at $70 billion. So you don't see many CEOs that make a 70 bagger on their way through the system as well. Something I'm quite proud of. And you know, I'm also a product of a very special relationship between our two countries. I actually was born and raised in Colorado. Went to engineering school in Colorado, went to law school, and worked in Texas. And so I've worked on both sides of this border, including about a decade through the boom of the North Sea, peak of North Sea growth there as well. But I have been a very proud Canadian citizen since 1996, although I keep my U.S. passport as well. And the unfortunate part of that is I happen to pay taxes in both countries, which you do not want to experience, I promise you on that. But anyway, very proud of that, and probably have a bit of a unique perspective of both cultures, of both countries, and how the system works. If I had one word to kind of say that something that we both cherish, it would be freedom. And that is, we share, among other things, a strong commitment to personal, to economic, and to political freedom. I would say our political system in Canada, our parliamentary system, seems to happen to work a lot better than yours does in Washington, but we could probably have that debate, okay, later on. But listen, we also share a determination to preserve our collective security, a bond that has only deepened since the tragic events of 9/11, which was felt in our country just as it was in yours. We need to recognize continental security is about more than just border enforcement and sharing in military and security intelligence. It's also about the continued flow of reliable, affordable, and responsibly developed energy. Energy is the lifeblood of this economy. Both our countries are really based upon relatively cheap forms of energy. It powers our factories, as mentioned earlier, transports our goods, creates our jobs, and shapes the quality of life that we enjoy here. I often talk about, listen, there is no free lunch. There is no energy source that doesn't have challenges. There is not a single one. Our really messages should be around expanding energy choices, not limiting them. So the thrust of my message today is that here in North America, we do have some serious choices to make. We can actually either support the responsible development of energy sources like the Canadian oil sands, or we have to depend as a society on far-flung sources of oil, ones that too often carry a much greater geopolitical and environmental risks than the ones that we know here today. And only the events in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt only point to the need for that even more today than it did even 3 or 4 months ago. So let me start kind of with Oil Sands 101 for those of you that don't know it well. And the ambassador outlined it well. 173, 175 billion barrels. You got to get your head around that. The second largest recoverable oil reserves in the world. I actually think that number's conservative. I would give you a number 3 or 4 times that, but we don't have the technology today to develop those reserves. The only thing I would say, and before I'm done, I'll talk a lot about technology, that will happen, and a lot of it will happen in your lifetime. It's not something that's a long ways out there. Now, it is a heavy oil. I often say, listen, God didn't give us light, carbon-free energy source. This is a heavy oil. It's what we have to deal with. It is our challenge. It is a hard job. I mean, we go from temperatures of a plus 30 degrees Celsius in the summertime to a minus 40 degrees in the winter. It has its own set of challenges as we're up there, as we take this very thick oil and convert it to light, sweet product and for the marketplace. Now, Suncor was the pioneering company. As I mentioned, it produced its first barrel of oil sands crude in 1967. And it would be easy to say, well, listen, why hasn't it moved more? Why hasn't a lot more happened? I would just say the first 25 years of development of this resource was very difficult. Almost every year, the return on capital was much, much lower than our cost of capital. It was amazing that until the middle 1990s, there were only 2 companies involved in this. And because it was such a marginal kind of business, unable to really put the kind of money in R&D that was necessary to make the changes. Now, since the middle of the 1990s, we've had many big players come in. virtually all the large oil and gas companies around the world, including Exxon, ConocoPhillips, Shell, BP. In fact, almost all of the U.S. Oil industry is there today. And the important part about that is today that competition is spurring more and more investment in R&D that helps change this thing. So even though the industry is relatively old, the technology curve we're going up is relatively young. And I often talk to Americans and say, remember, this is not just a Canadian U.S. issue. Most of these U.S. oil and gas companies are in your pension plan somewhere. So you're an investor in this, whether you really know it or not in some form or another. Today, we do produce about 1.4 million barrels from the oil sands. Whether it's 2015 or 2020, we're going to be at that 3 million. The capacity is much higher than that. And so we're very proud to be part of that growth story. We're the largest. We recently announced a 10-year strategy to boost our production to more than 1 million barrels a day, one single company. Approximately 4 out of every 5 of those barrels will come from oil sands, although we have investments in a number of countries around the world. So what's driving that industry growth? Obviously, the sheer size of the resources is part of it. And certainly, we have almost zero exploration costs. That's what's really interesting about our business. It's more like a manufacturing business than it is an exploration, conventional exploration business where you go out and drill a lot of dry holes. And that gives us, I think, the unique opportunity to focus on responsibly developing and technology over the very long term. In our business, we don't think even in 10 or 20 years, it's in 50-year timeframes. And maybe that's quite some of what helped me stay on for 20 years as opposed to the normal 5. But you're really talking about very long time frames and investments that last. Our first upgrader that we put in 1967 is still operating today at record levels. And that's something you got to think about in terms of plant and renewable and how you change capital over time to improve the overall footprint. In North American context, it's even more important because conventional crude is becoming harder and more expensive in deeper water, as we experienced with Macondo, and harder to find. So this is going to become even more important over the next decades here in terms of the context. I am, as I mentioned earlier, a pro-energy expansion. I think we got to look at energy from all sources. I'm actually pro-nuclear as well, although as we know, the recent events in Japan may set nuclear back for some time to be. And then it's the issue of accessibility, which Pat mentioned somewhat in terms of a local context. I'll give you a world context. Okay, so if you look at 80% of the world's known oil reserves, they're actually either state-controlled or managed by national oil companies, so they're not really available to the open market. That means of the remaining 20% that's really accessible to companies like ours and like Exxon and like Conoco and Chevron, that's really trying to access that 20% for the market. Now, the real interesting fact about that, of that 20%, 10% of that, or half of that, 10% of the world total of accessible is actually in Canada itself. So this is not an issue that's going to be a short range. It's going to be here for quite a long time. And why does that matter? It is really what kind of pulls back our two countries together. First, free societies must hold both governments and industry accountable and drive us towards real, long-term, sustainable energy solutions. Secondly, the constructive power of free markets. It's no coincidence that major technological advances that I mentioned have sprung, not just in our industry, but in most industries around the world, from free market economies. For these reasons, I'd argue that our oil sands is best positioned to meet North America's energy needs. So why is this view not universally embraced? Well, in some quarters, and listen, I regularly meet with Greenpeace, with NRDC, with other players. The oil sands industry is still a real subject of much concern, criticism, and controversy. It's obviously our biggest challenge, demonstrating that we can develop this resource in an environmentally and socially responsible way. Unfortunately, most Americans don't even know what oil sands is, but those that have certainly heard most of it around a label called dirty oil. It's a memorable phrase, it's a catchphrase, it's based more on fiction than on fact. And I don't have the time today to deal with many of the misleading statements, and you would see it as defensive if I went into that anyway. But I would like to put a couple of facts on the table. Yes, oil sands is an energy and water intensive, but we are making amazing strides on continuous improving our performance. We've harvested technology to reduce the amount of carbon we emit for each barrel of oil produced. We're down some 40% since 1990, and that's nowhere near the end of the road. Over the past 6 years, we at Suncor have reduced our freshwater intake by over 30%. Those are examples. And again, we're just on the beginning parts of this technology curve. And yes, we are an emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, but nothing like what some of our critics would depict. Right now, our industry is responsible for about 5% of Canada's greenhouse gas emissions and about 1/10% of global emissions. Now, one of the things you should remember, if I could leave you with a couple of quick kind of markers on that, and I think it is important to have some perspective on this, is that our whole industry in Canada produces less CO2 than the state of Indiana does producing electricity. And so you got to kind of really think your way all the way through that. And by the way, most Canadians couldn't point out the state of Indiana. I'm not sure that many Americans could either. So listen, we have a collective challenge. So finger pointing and blaming one section probably doesn't do it. One of the recent independent studies, this is not done by our industry, show that on a life cycle full wells to wheels analysis, oil sands crude is only marginally more carbon intensive than many other conventional oil sources. It's actually less intensive than some, including the heavy oil that's produced in Southern California, which is one point I always make. The Californians always try to put that out as far as they have a low carbon fuel standard, but of course they exempt their own heavy oil production, which all politics are local. I guess we're back to that. It's also very important to note that 80% of greenhouse gas emissions occur during the use of the fuel by the consumers, such as you, not in the production. So we got to actually look at this in a more holistic kind of sense. In the province of Alberta, I can tell you that it is one of the very few spots in North America that actually has a carbon tax. It's a tax that actually works quite well. It's a tax that does not go back into the general coffers, very important issue. Unfortunately, it is applied only to major emitters. But what I actually endorse on this tax, and you won't see CEOs that endorse many taxes, is it goes into a technology fund, okay? It does not go back into the general coffers and get lost. And that technology fund is about how we change our industry and other industries and our society to lower our carbon footprint. That's something that we can absolutely support. And by the way, none of the other major sources of U.S. oil, whether that's Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Nigeria, Mexico, or Brazil for that matter, have a single tax on greenhouse gas emissions, something else that needs to be at least thought about. The key to our future, though, is technology. And it's young people, it's people with a whole different set of ideas. It's things we're going to steal from other industries. It's about productivity, efficiency. So, some of the big challenges, can we make the oil sands become carbon neutral? Maybe not tomorrow, but I wouldn't say that that's out of the range. Can we devise waterless extraction technologies? Actually, I do believe we will. Now, we don't have that technology today, but I think it's on. Those are like the big questions, the big rocks that we're willing to take on as an industry, and we can make massive change. And I do think it will happen. Now, it may not happen on my watch, but I do think it will happen. In addition to improving traditional sources, renewable energy is a big part of that mix. And as I mentioned, all three of your speakers so far this morning have all had major investments. Suncor alone has invested close to $1 billion, or certainly will by 2012, over the last 10 years, $1 billion in renewables. So listen, it's an important part of the overall mix. Again, I'm for expanding energy sources, not contracting them. I think it's very important to keep noting that. So, the great thing about our industry is we've got a lot of technical expertise, we've got a lot of commercial expertise, and we also have a lot of access to capital. So there's not many constraints about bringing these changes on that I talked about. And as I mentioned, the research and development, I think, is just getting kicked off in this industry overall. So hopefully by now I've got you convinced that, listen, there is a different side to the why of oil sands development. I think it's important to our society. It's important in terms of us having a society that continues to work on a go-forward basis. But what about the how? And how do we make this a positive vision for an energy future a reality? First is we don't need to put up artificial barriers. In this regard, it was very encouraging to see President Obama's recent energy policy announcement where he was planning to reduce overall U.S. oil imports by some 30% by 2025. But he still cited Canada as a very steady and reliable partner who will very much remain the supplier of choice. Very important for us that Americans think in those kind of contexts. Secondly, we need improved infrastructure, and Pat really talked to that. I don't think I need to cover that. The third issue we need is greater certainty when it comes to national energy strategies and regulations. People are often surprised that I, as a CEO, actually have publicly supported the idea of carbon tax. But I would say supported only as long as it is applied equitably across all economic sectors among producers of all forms of energy. I mean, the trouble with the Waxman-Markey bill was, it was a carbon tax that exempted coal. Well, if Americans exempt coal, then listen, that's not a carbon tax. That is something else. And I think you got to really think about that. If we're going to invest, if we're going to continue to drive the investment in new technology, we're going to be required to find real long-term solutions. And if you want to do that, then a price on carbon may make some sense, again, as long as it's universally applied. Again, a molecule of carbon, whether it comes out of your tailpipe or it comes out of a coal-fired plant, is the same molecule of carbon. You got to make sure you get that in some context. And the fourth thing I would say is we need collaboration and harmonization between our two great countries as we address that energy future. One important thing, and if you talk about whether it's Afghanistan, World War II, our current work on Libya, a whole things, when it's always counted, the U.S. and Canada have always found a way to work together to a common good. And when it comes to securing our energy future as North America, I know we're going to do that again. Thank you very much.
David, thank you very much. I hope if there are students in the audience who haven't chosen an industry to go into, you consider energy. I've been in it for 25 years. I can tell you that it seems to be every 3 or 4 years it seems to take a complete change in direction. It's been fascinating, a lot of technology. It needs a lot of smart people. And so I hope some of you consider energy as a career. So I'm Mike Zenker. I work for Barclays Capital. We're not an energy producer or a pipeline company like you're hearing from. I'm here to kind of round out the discussion from a perspective of a financial institution. I'm also going to focus on natural gas. But just to give you a perspective, we're a lender and we raise capital for the energy industry, which is a fascinating part of the business to be in. One thing that you may not fully appreciate since you're here in North America is how unique the energy industry is in North America. There are a lot of very smart, creative, dynamic people, and if they find an idea for something that's cheaper or cleaner, and we raise money for them, they'll pursue it, whether that's oil sands, whether it's shale gas, whether it's wind power, and that's not true around the world. In a lot of places in the world, energy policy is set at a federal level. It tends to be staid. You tend not to have the dynamism that you have in North America, where you can bring outside capital, an industry pioneer, and they can bring new products to consumers as rapidly and as efficiently as you have in North America. Now, I happen to be from California, which some people don't even consider part of the U.S., but there's probably no state in the country that has so mistreated the energy relationship between U.S. and Canada as California has, so I start with an apology from that. Yes, California is the energy entertainment capital of the world, but it doesn't run on just star power. It runs on lots of hydrocarbons, whether it likes it or not, and you heard reference to that earlier. So I want to talk about natural gas. California is a large consumer of natural gas. A lot of that happens to come from Canada. You may not realize this, but Canada physically kept the lights on during the California power crisis. I was there for that event, and I think that's also taken for granted. So I had a chance to talk to some of the students this morning over breakfast and before we got started. Everybody seems to have heard about natural gas, particularly the new resource called shale gas production. And for those of you who haven't heard about this, this is drawing natural gas from a resource that the oil and gas industry has known about for decades. Shale is a very common geological formation, and it is a resource that has been trapping oil and gas. And the reason why geologists have known about it, it is what's called the source rock for typical oil and gas deposits around the world. So a lot of hydrocarbons embed themselves in shale, and when you find shale, you typically look for pools of oil and gas around it to then target commercially. The breakthrough in technology has been the ability to get the gas and oil out of the shale rock itself, as opposed to looking for where it has migrated to. In case you didn't know, the first shale gas well was drilled just outside of Fort Worth, Texas in 1982. And again, it was an industry where you had some diehard pioneers that kept picking away and picking away. As a matter of fact, I spoke at an event in Florida recently with a guy who was on that first rig drilling that first shale gas well, and it wasn't very successful, and they poured a lot of money into it. And again, that's something that's very unique to the North American energy market, is people that are willing to devote 20 years trying to develop oil sands or building pipelines from large resources far away to get to markets. And it's fascinating to see that come together. The ability to exploit shale gas resource in North America has meant that we've been growing supply at about 5% per year now for 5, and this will be the 6th year running, in a market where demand grows at 1% per year. And if you know anything about economics, that's called an imbalance, and it's caused prices to go very low. But it's a great opportunity for energy policy people, and you heard President Obama speak to that just a week ago, and I'll get to that in a second. But what has caused is natural gas has become so abundant in North America that it's displacing coal. So not only is Thierry's hydroelectric resource displacing coal, but we've had natural gas displacing coal as well, physically idling existing coal-fired power plants, running gas-fired units instead on a cash cost basis. That's just cheaper to do. It's actually undermined the economics of renewables in lots of parts of North America as well, as it's driving the wholesale price of power down for places where renewables need to compete with bulk power, like Thierry has to do. We're finding that wind and solar are simply out of the money compared to where natural gas is, and nuclear power suddenly is horribly out of the money, unfortunately. Now, that's not to say that it's not an energy strategy to pursue a diversified energy platform. You heard Rick refer to nuclear as an option that we should keep on the table. I'm not here to say that natural gas is going to be cheap forever, and when we talk to power companies, you hear them go for portfolio strategies because it's not clear that natural gas will be as abundant and cheap as it is today. But now the idea, and I saw Boone Pickens on TV this morning. If you're not familiar with Boone Pickens, a big Texas former oilman, he's been pushing for natural gas use in transportation, primarily in trucking, and so there's the opportunity maybe to actually displace seaborne oil imports. That's his big push, is to lessen U.S. dependence on OPEC oil by using natural gas directly in transportation. If you travel around the country, you'll see a lot of taxi fleets, a lot of trash haulers, a lot of buses now using natural gas, and that's the push there. And then finally, there's even talk about U.S. and Canada exporting natural gas by liquefying it and sending it to Europe and Asia. So that's how abundant natural gas has been. And just to put it in context, you heard just when we kicked off, the Ambassador Jacobson talked about how weakly endowed the U.S. is in oil resource. Well, North America has 40% of the shale gas resource globally, at least as far as we know. Given how new it is, we don't really know how abundant it is around the world. But but the two strengths that we have, not only do we have a fantastic resource base in natural gas, but we've got an industry that if you give them the opportunity to serve markets and you give them the capital to do it, and that's where the banks tend to come in, they will rapidly turn that cheaper and cleaner resource to the market. Interestingly, natural gas, if you listen to Obama's State of the Union speech, and if you're in the energy industry, that's a must-do. Every January, you have to listen to the State of the Union speech. You have to listen to every energy speech that he gives. He didn't use the word natural, or use the words natural gas in the State of the Union speech two years ago. The push was for green jobs. And if you then listen to the so-called blueprint speech that President Obama gave a week ago Wednesday, when he referred to new clean alternatives for the U.S. in energy, the very first energy source he talked about was natural gas. So why the big transformation? Well, It could be, and I haven't talked to President Obama, so I'm giving you my interpretation, that the American public doesn't see the connection between a wind turbine and $4 a gallon for gasoline at the pump. And natural gas is really the only meaningful resource in the short term that might begin to move the needle from two standpoints. One, direct use in vehicles, and second, for power generation to provide electric vehicle motive power like Thierry talked about. And unfortunately, outside of hydroelectric resources in Canada, the U.S. is looking at probably a much more different basket of fuels or power options. And so if we're going to grow electric vehicle use in the U.S., you've got to fuel it from something other than just Hydro-Quebec's resources in the Northeast. And the other thing about natural gas is it's jobs. It's a lot of jobs. It's a lot of continuing jobs. These shale wells, when you drill them, they typically are running at about 15% of first day capacity 365 days later, so the resource depletes very quickly. That's actually intentional. You get your money back much faster as a producer, but it also means you have to continue to drill and drill and drill. The great news about this resource is the success rate in drilling for natural gas in these shale plays is nearly 100%. And so that's the attraction, is once you find it, it's very easy to replicate the success in those wells, and it's unlocked this tremendous resource potential that we have. But both jobs and the fact that natural gas is relatively clean compared to certainly coal alternatives in the power sector is, I suspect, what's driving its renewed interest at the policy level. But what's fascinating is, and a couple of students this morning over breakfast asked the perfect question. So, okay, we found all this gas, what are we going to do with it? Well, we actually, in the U.S., lack a policy lens to know what to do with natural gas. We don't have a plan that says, here's where we're trying to go, how does natural gas fit into it? It wasn't policy that drove this supply abundance. It wasn't policy that drove oil sands. It was the markets. It was the markets recognizing that there was something cleaner and cheaper, and let's go develop it. And now we have an opportunity from a policy perspective to try to put that in place. I was also asked this morning, what demand are gas producers trying to shoot for? What are they, what level are they trying to get to? What are they trying to grow to? Well, the answer is they're not. They're just trying to produce, and they're hoping that the market's there. And the biggest markets are for natural gas that are untapped are transportation and the power sector. And here's where the dilemma comes in. You're not going to rapidly use natural gas in the transportation sector without some kind of policy push, like T. Boone Pickens is suggesting. And we'll wait to see whether Congress acts on that. And then the other dilemma is in the power sector, you've got power companies, power plant developers, who are dealing with a host of issues. They're not clear whether there's going to be carbon legislation in North America. They've got existing coal-fired power plants that they're running that they fully paid for. They're not clear whether they should shut those plants and those jobs down, whether they should move to an alternate technology. Is nuclear something that they should keep on the table as a viable option? So as I travel around the U.S. and Canada and meet with power producers, outside of the lucky few who have great things like tremendous hydroelectric resource capability, they really struggle with knowing what the next new power resource is because there isn't a policy for what to go for. They don't really know what that 20, 30, 40-year investment should be. But I would suggest that with the tremendous abundance of natural gas, and it's not just U.S., Canadian shales are certainly playing a role in this growing amount of supply, that there's an opportunity to link this huge supply that's already here, it isn't potential, to the kind of clean air, clean energy, clean transportation policy goals that I know the U.S. is shooting for, but hasn't actually put into place. I can tell you that from a capital market standpoint, there's every number of sources of financing of capital that would love to finance whatever new technologies, new energy sources that you might think of are out there. There's actually the velocity of money moving into the space in the last couple of years has continued to grow, so that's certainly not a constraint. I would suggest that what the industry hopes doesn't happen is a big energy policy U-turn or, as Rick referred to it, some artificial barrier that slow the rapid development of this particular resource down in any form. I want to stop and keep my comments brief and get to your questions. So David, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. I have a lot of questions, but You came to the conference, and we've got a great panel here. Thank you all for really good remarks. You saw me writing away, and I could continue the conversation here. There are microphones, I'm told, two guys in the back, so let's have some questions. Back row here. Could you please identify yourself?
Surely. My name is Robert Allen. I'm a dual degree between the Nicholas School of the Environment and the Fuqua School of Business. On behalf of the student body, I just want to thank all you gentlemen for joining us. This is a distinct privilege for all of us. This is for the panel in general, and I'm very intrigued. Mr. George, you mentioned about the water intensity of oil sands, but I also, Mr. Vando, as well, with regard to the BC, sorry, I just came back from Vancouver. I was thinking BC Hydro. With Quebec Hydro, I'm intrigued to hear how you compensate and calculate for the risk of water decrease in years to come. That greatly affects both of your businesses and energy security. So,
yeah, we're involved in research. You're talking about climate change, global warming, et cetera. We're involved in research. I mean, there are these models which are interesting at the global level, but doesn't do much for our business. I mean, we want to know what's going to happen in areas that are, a smaller mesh. So we're involved in research projects which look at the north of Canada, the north of Quebec, and all indications is that it's going to get warmer fast. And so that there, in terms of the ecosystems are going, there's going to be some shocks to some ecosystems, but the permafrost, for example, we don't touch those areas per se, but all of those models also point that it's going to become, because it's going to become warmer, it's going to become more humid. What people don't recognize easily in terms of the north is a very dry area. Where we have our reservoirs, we have these very, very large catchment basins, I mean the size of countries in Europe, because it doesn't rain all that much and it doesn't snow all that much. The snow that accumulates over winter is actually pretty limited. But all models suggest that it's going to get warmer, and because it's going to get warmer, it's also going to get more humid. So our business, frankly, looks like it's going to have more water flowing through the existing facilities, which would be good. I'm not suggesting climate change or global warming is a good thing. I'm just saying that all the research that we're doing and we're supporting indicates warmer and more humid.
Yeah, so if I can take it on from oil sands, I mean, for our particular company, we don't see this as a huge issue in terms of accessibility to water in the next 10 or 20 years. We're actually waterlong. And so if you take a look at the industry taking water from the Athabasca River, for example, it's at maximum 2%. It usually, actually last year was 1%. So you got to think, and just to give you some statistics, even in Alberta, the statistic always is the Bow River as it goes through Calgary is 60% committed to agriculture, cities, or some other uses you go through there. But the key, again, is technology. So the key is recycle. It's using brackish water. For example, the refinery we run in Edmonton runs off of city water, used city water, gray water. And so those are the things you got to pursue. And you know what? If it gets to that point, we'll actually take brackish water and clean it up. But again, this is all about technology and investment, wise investment as we go forward. In the region that we operate in northern Alberta, it's dry. But what I would say is we don't see this as a real limitation to growth, particularly given these other plans I talked about.
Pat, Mike, anything? Over here, and then up here.
Thank you very much. My name is Will Fodderhunt. I'm also a dual degree at the Nicholas School of the Environment and the Business School here. You all mentioned some level of believing in sort of the power of markets, but at the same time, we're calling for policy changes, and that seems to be a little bit. There's a discrepancy there in that without policy, pipelines don't get built without the threat of eminent domain, and transmission doesn't get built, and certainly capital markets don't lend unless they're not going to lend to a project that pays back over 30 years. So that assumes that energy markets are not free markets, and probably nor should they be. So I guess what is the unifying policy that that you see would be most beneficial to sustainable, responsible development, I guess, across each of your sectors? Is it a revenue-neutral carbon tax? Is it something more?
I think one of the things that perhaps we share with Pat is the idea that, if you want to move the resource is an area, you got to move it to markets, and some form of simplification of the regulatory and permitting process, an eminent domain situation that would be, clear-cut, that would allow federal or state agencies to operate. We've been able in Canada, because of the way that the jurisdictions operate, the federal government doesn't play a role in permitting. It's just at the provincial level, state level equivalent, and the state is the only game in town. So that you have one process, you know when it starts, you know when it ends. There are set periods of time, and at the end, you have a very certain eminent domain established by an act that has been there for a long time. So that would make, I think, a huge difference from our perspective in terms of transmission.
Yeah, and I guess the only thing I would add to that is that, from a policy point of view, and I think of particular relevance to this this discussion today, is harmonization between Canada and the U.S. And that's one of the big challenges that we face as a pipeline company crossing a border. We're subject to National Energy Board regulation in Canada, to FERC regulation in the U.S., and then for a border crossing, you need a presidential permit, which is the thing that is holding up the project that the ambassador referred to earlier. But a level of harmonization, recognizing that we are in a North American energy market, and to have to not go through two distinct sets of regulations and steps in order to get projects approved would be very helpful.
Where I was going to take that answer is maybe a little bit higher level than you might want. But you know what? If you talk about regulation or policy that would make a difference, I think it's really we in Canada, and there's a group of us working hard on this, is a national energy strategy. Okay, and that's got to be kind of very broad, very encompassing. And I think if you could do that and lay out a roadmap that people can follow, and then I think it makes all these infrastructure issues and the choices a lot clearer. It's probably a lot easier to do in Canada. First of all, we're a small country. Land mass is huge, much bigger than the U.S., but in terms of, we have the same population of the state of Texas or the state of California. And so I think getting some agreement to that is maybe easier. But it has to be a policy that includes how we look at our cities. It includes, in Canada, we only have one city that has our light rail system between the airport and the downtown. That happens to be Vancouver, and that is only because of the Olympics. And so you got to look at a whole bunch of systems. And I think if we actually could get to a national energy strategy, and if you think about the countries that have done this really well, look at China as an example, though I don't know about well, but at least they have a direction. France on nuclear has done a terrific job. Germany. If you look at the countries that have really done this well, they do have a national energy strategy. I think it's much more difficult to get to in the U.S. because of the U.S. political system and because everybody in this country fights their own corner. But I would say watch this space. I think we're going to come out with something in Canada that is actually driven by business, which I think is actually where it's going to come from rather than from the political side. Now, whether we can get that actually endorsed and through, I don't know. But at least I think that's, if you want to talk about broad policy, that's where I think I would head.
Over here, there's a...
Hi, my name is Elena. I'm an undergraduate studying economics and math here. And in some ways, my question somewhat dovetails quite neatly with the last one. And it's for Mr. Daniel. And I was wondering if Enbridge might be willing at some point to kind of echo what Mr. George from Suncor just said in publicly endorsing a carbon tax. And if not, kind of what very specifically like incentive-based solutions Enbridge might be willing to look into for kind of creating a more sustainable energy future.
Yeah, we in fact do endorse the carbon tax and have for some time at Enbridge. And but we're very much in the same camp as Rick on the issue, in that we don't want to see the carbon tax funds go into the general coffers. We do want to see them oriented towards a technology fund in order to ensure that they're directed towards the purpose of the carbon tax. And to give you an example of what I mean, you know, we because we're in the renewables business, we build solar, we build wind, but it has to be highly subsidized in order to be profitable for any business to be in, to attract the capital that Mike was referring to earlier. And so if the carbon tax is directed towards something like that, subsidization or development of new technologies, then I think it makes great sense. But in Ontario alone, the power grid power is about 6 cents a kilowatt hour. I think we generate wind at about 12 cents and solar at 43 cents. So we've got a long way to go. I mean, you're not going to get corporations coming in and investing in the business unless it can be made economic. That means subsidization is required to ensure those projects go ahead, and that might be a reasonable direction for the tax, or to reduce carbon emissions, but something aimed at fixing the problem and not just into the general coffers.
There was a question here in the brown shirt.
Hi, I'm Bob Healy. I'm Professor Emeritus at the Nicholas School and the Sanford Institute. Michael Zinker put his finger on something that's bothered me for a long time, which is, what do we do with all this natural gas? And we've known about this for 3-4 years, about the differential between liquids and gas. And it seems like all the solutions are incredibly unimaginative. And you have all these players, you have free markets. Why don't we have, for example, gas to liquid seems to be of no interest. And even some of the simplest things, like what about running the Mississippi River barge fleet on gas rather than on diesel? But it's not happening, and I'm just curious to know why you're talking about substituting for coal, which seems to be a wasteful use of a great fuel, rather than figuring out ways to actually use this at the kind of the higher use that it, I think, deserves.
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it gets to the question on policy that was asked earlier. I had a chance to talk to an owner of a very large trucking fleet that is looking at using natural gas instead of diesel fuel, and there's two things that characterize it. Truckers are what are technically called cheap. They don't like to spend a lot of money on things that aren't going to work. But the other thing is that this particular CEO was worried that he would spend a lot of money on a bunch of new trucks running on natural gas, and then the rules would change again. And so, you know, it gets to the kind of the regulatory certainty that, all right, if I'm going to make this investment, don't come around 2 years from now and say, now I've got to turn them all to electric vehicles or something like that. This particular gentleman was interested in a subsidy for him converting his trucks. Actually, you don't convert them, you just buy natural gas burning trucks instead of diesel fuel trucks. And the idea that there might be a tax credit coming was stalling his uptake of that technology. There's nothing particularly new about running vehicles on natural gas. There's a lot of countries that do it at very high levels. But in fact, there's only one natural gas vehicle available last year in the U.S. It was the Honda NGX, and they didn't sell the ones that they brought to the country. And that's a fuel station issue and probably a public acceptance issue. That can change pretty quickly, but I think it's going to take a little bit of a kickstart at the government level. The state of Oklahoma is doing it. They're running a lot of the vehicles in Calgary, actually, on propane, the taxi fleets. San Francisco requires that an alternate fuel vehicle be put in place for all taxis. So you're starting to see that, and it's actually causing the cost to go down quite quickly. But frankly, in terms of the overall supply in North America, relative to supply in North America, it doesn't even move the needle yet. That means we've got a lot more demand that we could swing over to natural gas before we go there. On gas to liquids, just in case the audience doesn't know, that's taking natural gas molecules, running it through some type of reformer, and then turning it into a longer chain hydrocarbon and in liquid form. And then you could sell it in liquid fuel stations. It's expensive. We haven't seen a technology breakthrough yet that's lower than, say, $80 a barrel, and that's with free natural gas. So it doesn't look like we've had a technology breakthrough that causes GTLs to be in the money just yet.
Pat?
Yeah, I think that Mike basically addressed both points that I was going to refer to. We operate the largest natural gas vehicle fleet in Canada in our gas distribution utility in Ontario. The big challenge is refueling stations, and the big opportunity is in heavy hauler trucks, but the conversion cost is in excess of $50,000 a truck to do it, so it's a real challenge for individual truck owners. We're in the process right now participating with a couple of the gas producers in Canada at building the refueling infrastructure along the Trans-Canada Highway on a pilot basis to see whether we can't start to get some momentum behind it. But so I think it does have great opportunity, but realize that it's very dependent on a low natural gas price relative to high oil price. And this phenomenon has been around for 3 to 4 years. It looks like it's going to be here for some time because of shale gas, but there were many years in the past where it was very different. And I think consumers of natural gas are afraid we might go back to the old relationship in terms of pricing.
On the power side, I'd challenge the idea that I think a good use of natural gas, is to displace some of the coal we have. In the context of, you don't need to accelerate shutdown, et cetera. A lot of these coal facilities are challenged today, given just the environmental regulations that exist, let alone those that are going to be put forward soon by EPA, for very good reasons. I mean, you've got mercury issues, sulfur dioxide, NOx issues, particulates. There are health issues related to these air emissions that, let alone greenhouse gas, just very standard health issues in terms of air emissions. You can throw a lot of capital at it to deal with it, which is what was done with SOx, sulfur dioxide, but you're left with others. In that sense, I think the scenario is one of seeing a gradual decline of coal. It won't disappear, but a gradual decline. As your facilities come at the end of their capital period, you invest in gas. I mean, gas is there, and it's a great fuel to produce electricity, especially in the context where it may be that nuclear is not an easy option to pursue. I mean, this is an industry that was trying to restart the whole supply chain for nuclear, and you get an event like Fukushima. I can tell you, we have a nuke plant, and we've got today we've got public hearings on not the idea of building a new nuke plant, but of refurbishing the one that we have. I can tell you, I was getting calls before coming in here. It's a challenged situation.
I noticed there was 1 or 2 more questions, but I wanted to ask one that just sort of came up, and it came up last night in the discussion we had over dinner, was regulatory certainty. Fears of you do something and then all of a sudden the rules are going to change. And Chair, it was interesting when you talked about eminent domain, that the laws have been in place for a long time. We don't have to worry about them and we can move ahead on them. So let me throw that out to the panel very quickly, if you can sort of comment on that.
Yeah, I can say that from our standpoint, a significant change in regulatory policy can make a project that looked great yesterday become completely unfinanceable tomorrow. Nuclear, after Fukushima, suddenly is going to be a very difficult kind of project to raise capital. That's not to say that there's two plants under construction in the U.S., Vogtle and Summer, and then Tennessee Valley Authority is going to bring Watts Bar 3 probably online ultimately. Those may go, but for anyone looking to build a new nuclear plant that has to go to the outside capital markets after Fukushima, that's just a much bigger challenge. Now that's a public risk, public perception standpoint, but equally, if a pipeline is proposed and wants to raise capital and a state decides to erect barriers, or there's an LNG terminal that's proposed and the government steps in the way, either federal, state, or provincial, suddenly it just makes it very difficult to raise capital for that. So that's just from the investor standpoint.
All right, we'll think about that. We're running low on time. There's 2 questions right here. Well, first we'll hear from the woman in the purple, and then from Janet. And then we'll take the 2 questions together, and then we'll...
Hey, good morning. My name is Emily Martin, and I'm also a joint business and environmental management student. And you all mentioned regulatory uncertainty, but I'm curious how you handle uncertainty around climate change, not policies to address climate change, but the actual physical effects. We talked a little bit about water availability. Stronger storms might be disruptive to your supply chains, or other effects that I'm not thinking of. How do you think about that when you're making these long-term, large investments?
Okay. climate change. And Janet, have your question.
I'm Janet Pease. I'm with Pew Center on Global Climate Change. And I wanted to ask both Mr. Daniels and George about Alberta's climate program. Now, I've been at climate policy for some time now. And from Kane-Lieberman's bill to the wax market, the opponents tend to point to huge impacts on the economy, huge impacts on jobs. Any kind of climate policy, doesn't matter what policy we're talking about, it's going to cost jobs and hurt the economy. So Alberta now has had a climate program for some number of years. In fact, it has a $15 price on carbon emissions in the province, and has had. So has that really damaged your industry? Has it had implications? Has it really cost you jobs? You have practical experience, and I'm curious as to what that experience has been.
So maybe I'll take, Janet, your question first, and Emily will get to yours maybe. And so I'll take a first cut at this. Sure. So listen, I think first of all, what you got to remember about the Alberta system is it is just a tax on major emitters. So it is not the kind of tar carbon tax that we're talking about being supportive, and that is to tax all carbon equally. So you got to get that in your framework. It is a $15 charge above a base year, and so it's another tax. It's a tax for sure. And so, would we rather not have the tax? Probably. Unless it is, again, back to a real carbon tax. If you're not going to have a real carbon tax, it's just something else. The only thing I would point out to it is it has not cost a lot of jobs, but partly because we're just turning that money back on technology, which creates jobs. If anything, in Alberta, you got to remember the other thing with our system and our society is, in the northern part of Alberta, even through the drop of the recession of 08, 09, early 010, we had new capital in the northern part of Alberta to the tune of $8 to $10 billion. I mean, I think it'll actually get up to $20 billion here in the next couple of years, per year. That's per year. So you don't have anything like that in North America. Our issue is not jobs. Our issue is actually things like inflation. Can we get enough manpower? Can we get the technical skills we want? Lots of other challenges. So I think in our system it probably works. That doesn't mean that it's going to work broadly in every place in the United States, especially where you don't have jobs. But that's not our issue. So I think it's a little bit different. I don't know, Pat, if you want to pile in. And then we definitely get to Emily's question.
Yeah, maybe I'll address Emily's question first, and in a way I think address the climate issue. But I'm going to give a very general response to what I think was a rather more specific question as to what the impact is on our operations, because the day-to-day impact with regard to climate change is relatively small, because of course climate change is a very gradual process. But we as a company and as an industry are very aware and of the changes that are occurring in the worldwide climate, and are certainly not arguing with regard to the science that it may be as a result of greenhouse gas emissions, and hence are doing everything we can in terms of our operations to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to move towards a more renewable slate of energy worldwide. And Enbridge, for example, we actually now have direct emissions below our 1995 levels as a result of a number of initiatives taken, and that's on an absolute basis, not just on an intensity basis. But most importantly, we're transitioning the company, but we're transitioning recognizing that there is such a huge demand worldwide for energy that it would be completely irresponsible to discontinue the development of hydrocarbons overnight just to address the issue and the concerns around climate change. And one of the points that we've tried to make at Enbridge, and I tried to make it in my introductory remarks, is that we North Americans take energy for granted. And we walk into the room and flick the light switch. Well, if we eliminated the use of hydrocarbons today, you could not walk into the room and flick the light switch. It's as simple as that. And more importantly, in my mind, is bringing energy to people that don't have access to. We've got over 1 billion people worldwide that don't have access to affordable energy. Their lives are not an awful lot of fun. And one of the things that we have done as an organization is started up a foundation that we've called Energy for Everyone that works around the world, trying to bring an appreciation to some of the people in North America that are volunteering to work through the organization for what it's like to live without access to energy. And I'm telling you, many people, most people in the world would give anything to have a gallon of gasoline. And sure, maybe they would like some solar along with it as well, but that isn't economically viable to do. So we're moving very much in the direction of reducing emissions, to transitioning the company as quickly as we can, but recognizing it would be irresponsible to stop development of hydrocarbons today.
In terms of the question, the idea of climate change or global warming, I mean, first of all, we see it. You know, we see clearly demonstrations of it in the north, especially because that's where it's most active. And it's forcing us to build into our scenario planning adaptations to how we operate. But it also creates opportunities. I mean, this is not all bad. I mean, for example, we're clearly seeing some signs of warmer winters, which allows us to free up capacity so that we can export. So we've been exporting big time. We see much longer rainfall events in the fall and later snow, and that's great because snow is a promise for us. You don't know if it's going to evaporate or it's going to go into the reservoir. Water is right into the reservoir. So it's creating these opportunities, but it's really the discussion around this is one that, 10, 15 years ago wasn't happening. Today it is happening within the organizations in a very natural way because you see it happen, you see these demonstrations. The other thing that we need to do is understand better, and that's why the idea of investing in these research programs, getting universities to participate, because the climate was very, very different in the past. And in French, the word is paléoclimatologie, the idea of understanding climate evolutions in the past and trying to see, what patterns of the past could be developing and how do we adapt our operations to that. So it's a great science, and the idea that you're doing, your studies of putting environment and business together, I think that's going to be huge in the coming decades.
Well, we're already at the end. This is a great panel. Thank you, gentlemen, very, very much. I think we've heard about the challenges and opportunities of energy in different markets. I think it's really interesting about the question of carbon taxes and climate change and where does this go. But also, I think it highlights what we know and what we don't know about energy and our energy choices, the things that we have to know and have to make where we live and how we live, what we choose to use, and what we invest in. So help me thank this group. And then before we clap, I believe the word was earlier, and I think it still is, that there is enough room at lunch for everybody. And that is around the corner in the Kirby Reading Room, and there'll be plenty of people to show you where to go if you don't know where it is. So now, please help me thank this panel.
Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.